Welcome. We are excited to be joining you today. The topic of our conversation is going to be diversity, equity, and inclusion. And our focus is on how do you go about bridging the gap between your contingent workforce strategy and your full-time workforce strategy. We have 20 minutes with you today, so we're going to just jump right in. What we will do is welcome questions, so please feel free to add your questions to the chat. My name is Jocelyn Lincoln, and I am the Chief Talent Officer here at Kelly. I'm responsible for our 400,000 plus temporary employee workforce, and that includes everything from experience design, performance management, and ongoing engagement models. Alex?
Hello, I'm Alexandra Foster, and I'm the Senior Director of People Strategy and Experience here at Kelly. And I am responsible for really creating an experience that our employees enjoy, our full-time employees, and that's everything from managing our talent acquisition team to leading our efforts around inclusion and diversity, culture, employee engagement, sustainability, and a variety of other unique projects that we have going on at Kelly at this time.
I'm glad you're able to join today, Alex, and
Thanks
big
for having me.
job as well. So here's what you can expect over our time together. The first thing is we're going to define diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll jump right into establishing DEI as a priority. We'll talk about a subject that most people dread, but it's really important, and it's an understanding of why DEI initiatives sometimes fail and making sure that we have safeguards in place to ensure that doesn't happen. And then we'll get into measuring the efficacy of DEI, and lastly end with some keynotes around action planning for success. So Alex, as you know, I'm a person that believes that words matter. And so often we're using the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we're realizing is that there's some confusion around what specifically each term means. And so wanting to be sure that we're providing a definition here in its purest sense. So diversity being the state of being diverse. It's about the practice of quality of including people from different ranges, social diversity, ethnic diversity, racial diversity, etc. Also gender diversity. Inclusion is a matter of presenting opportunities and being inclusive in how we go about working within a group or a structure. For me, I believe that all of these things line up together, and you cannot have one without the other. And that's sometimes what companies do. We sometimes focus on diversity, but we miss inclusion, and we're surprised at the outcome. And then obviously equity is that idea of just being impartial. So DEI, you've heard it referred to, you're being invited to the dance, and then if you get asked to dance. But I'm a person that I believe that it's very important for us to be rooted in just the commonality and really the expectation of what these words carry. Alex, anything you would add here?
Yeah, and I think it's just the difference really between equity and equality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And equity is making sure that experience is fair, whereas equality means you get the same treatment. And in reality, sometimes equality doesn't equal equity. So it's also knowing the nuance there between those two words, which is really important that we define, as you mentioned, Jocelyn.
Yeah, and the last piece I'll leave here is that inclusion. A lot of times, inclusion is about the culture, and so you'll notice that inclusion is more of an outcome oftentimes. So if we're doing all the things that we need to do and we're creating a culture of trust and belonging, inclusion is about an outcome that exists there. So, Alex, I thought I'd start with you and why DEI is emerging as a business priority. In a recent study from SIA, 63% of survey respondents said they expect, as a result of some of the social injustices from last year, for DEI to continue to remain a priority, or start to become even a higher priority from a business strategy perspective. What are you seeing?
Yes, I agree. DEI is not a new priority. For quite some time, organizations have wanted to harness the value of innovation and ensure that employees had equitably enriching careers and experiences. And so that is what drove some organizations early on, 30, 40, 50 years ago to say, we are going to explore diversity, equity, and inclusion, maybe before those words were well defined from a workplace perspective. More recently, as you mentioned, though, DEI has become a focus as organizations have begun to understand the impact and the value of investing in diversity from those earlier organizations. Specific to the incidents of last year, right? We saw the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and too many others, compounded by the impact of COVID on communities of color. And so what we see now is that organizations have found that it's an imperative that they focus on closing the gap, whether that's gaps in representation, gaps in experiences of diverse communities, and also really understanding allyship and understanding how to support groups in an effective way that leads to an outcome of success for the organization and inclusion of all employees. We know that teams who are more inclusive and more diverse are more innovative. They yield more outcomes, whether that's financial, so looking at the bottom line of an organization, or overall success in a culture. And so really what we've seen is this embrace to understand and expedite DEI initiatives and strategies. And so I think it's very important that we're having this conversation about how different groups who support DE&I from different lenses within an organization can come together and drive positive outcomes.
Absolutely. And I think the other partner piece to that is when you start to think about the inclusion of the contingent workforce. So in a lot of organizations, as they start, excuse me, to think about their DEI strategy and practice, they're very focused on their full-time employee population. But we're starting to see more and more organizations extend that to be much more of a holistic approach and the inclusion of what their contingent workers are experiencing, and starting to look at their suppliers as a partner to help them drive their DEI strategy and their principles and make those more permeable throughout the entire organization. So as we said, oftentimes we're seeing DEI as a priority, emerging priority, a strategic business imperative. But why do these programs fail? And here we've included just some high-level reasons and things for this audience to really keep in mind, depending on where you are in your journey. If you're early on as you're thinking about your strategy, or even if you're a more mature organization and you've had a DEI practice for an extended period of time, it's still, all of these points are very practical. So I'll start with the first one, and Alex, please feel free to add, but oftentimes the biggest impediment to DEI success is a lack of alignment to the company purpose and business strategy. So many organizations jump in without a clear view of what their end game is and what their business objective is. And as a result of that, it's not necessarily easy to see how that's tying back to their overall corporate plans. And when you have initiatives that appear untethered to a strategy, it becomes more of a pet project. It becomes person dependent, and it doesn't become just embedded as the organization's DNA. In addition to that, there's no clear success metric. So if we're not clear about what our intent is, what our outcome that we're looking for is, we're then not going to have the success metrics of how are we going to know what good looks like, and how will we know that we've reached the point of what we set out to do, and recognizing that this is also a journey, but your success metrics have to be tied back to your business strategy. And then I think there's a sense of doubling down on just these outdated approaches. The mandates, the you will do this, the mandates around training, the mandates around, I'm using air quotes, quotas that we've seen are not necessarily successful. It has to be, your DEI strategy has to be tied not only to your business purpose, but also the environments in which you're serving. So for global organizations that maybe they're building DEI strategies in Europe, it may be more about gender diversity, for example, especially in countries where you have women's rights that are very much lagging behind what we see in the US. For other organizations, DEI and diversity initiatives may look very different. And then of course, the classic command and control of, the authoritarian approach in ensuring, and this is a way I think organizations have tried to have a degree of accountability, but often what they miss is the social accountability that needs to happen. There's a peer accountability, and there's an inclusion of the workforce that needs to happen as well. Alex, I know you have plenty to add to this as well.
Yes. Well, this is a great list, and I think you've covered. It's been very comprehensive. The couple things that I would add is, context. Context is really critical. You mentioned this a little bit as you explored global organizations, right? And knowing what is a priority from an I&D perspective or a DEI perspective in the US may look vastly different than what it looks like in Germany, right? Or China, because the communities are different, the cultures are different, and even how you approach DE&I globally shifts. So I think context is critical. And then the other piece that I would say is just really caring about your employees, whether they're full-time or contingent, and asking critical questions about what is the lived experience of people who work in our environment or our organization. Very critical.
Yeah, and I completely agree. There's an opportunity for organizations. I've seen best practices around listening tours and
Mhm.
taking the time to really just listen to what the employee's current experience is. And that can include your contingent workforce as well, taking the time to understand what is it like to be a contingent worker at this organization? How do I feel when I have to wear a different colored t-shirt? How do I feel when I have to enter a different enter the building in a different way, or my badge looks different, and am I being included? And I know so many organizations oftentimes struggle with this idea of co-employment, but there's an opportunity there that most organizations need to make sure that we're taking the time to understand co-employment risk, and that's where you can partner with organizations like Kelly and those that are managing your programs.
Yes.
So that gets into how do you measure DEI? And it's really fascinating because I've heard of the difficulties of measurement, but I believe difficulties with measurement is often tied back to an incomplete strategy. And if we're very clear on what we're trying to measure,
Mhm.
the efficacy of what it is we're trying to achieve, the measurement piece becomes a lot clearer. So one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of companies, when we first start, we want to improve our diversity. So then you drill down, okay, what specifically, what categories, what is it we're trying to do, and the why behind it. And you start to get a different level of detail. What I hear less companies talking about is we've brought these diverse individuals into the organization, be it gender diversity, racial, ethnic, neurodiversity, whatever it may be. But what is our retention strategy, and how are we measuring retention? So again, correlating your success factors to the business objective of what you're trying to achieve. But what else would you say about the measurement of DEI?
I would certainly say, I talked earlier about experience, it's in my title, so it may be a little bit expected, but I think if we're really going to measure the effectiveness of a DE&I strategy or approach, we have to measure what people know, think, believe, and do, right? Because that's the differentiator. What do our people say and feel about where they work? And that can be quantitative or qualitative. We can look at things like demographics and representation, but we can also survey our teams. We can look at absenteeism. We can look at
Mhm.
velocity. How quickly are folks being promoted in the organization? And then break that down into whatever demographics are important for our area. You could look at billable hours, compensation, who's utilizing learning management systems or mentoring programs. Those are all quantitative.
Mhm.
Then you have qualitative. You have exit interviews, stay interviews, focus groups, participation in DE&I activities and programs, whether that's affinity groups, learning sessions. So I think it's about intent, right? And it's getting at what we want to change and impact. And that should always be the experience that employees have with us, but then also how they feel. And so making sure that you're balancing those two quantitative and qualitative outcomes is really critical in the DE&I space, whether you're talking about full-time or contingent workers.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's definitely opportunity to ensure that we're looking at all of those key factors. And historically, if you think about the role that procurement has played in the DEI approach, they've looked at diverse supplier spend. And so being able to understand how to apply some of those key metrics and their conclusion or their contribution to the DEI strategy and the bridge role that HR and procurement can play within the organization. I know I've had conversations where you're talking to the HR partner and they're being held to a very specific set of standards or goals or measures around their DEI strategy. And then you talk to the procurement individual in the same organization and they're being held to a very different standard. And that's where you start to have that mismatch and what the approach needs to be and why we're not achieving the goals that we want to achieve. So the other pieces that I would add is making sure that you understand the access to data that you have with your partners as well. So, asking for the composition of the contingent workforce. What does that look like? What's the sourcing plan to have an inclusive sourcing strategy? And how are you engaging your partners to create a measurement plan, I think is also a key takeaway around measuring efficacy.
Yeah. You just
So
really talk about dialogue, right?
yes.
Sharing messages and priorities and goals, which is also really critical.
Yes, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about and the action planning. So being the bridge, because we're talking to two audiences here, and we're talking to procurement and HR leaders and the role that they can play in being the bridge. And so the first one that I would start with, Alex, is leading with data and making sure that you have a really good and solid understanding at a strategic level what your aims are, where you're starting from, so that you can effectively benchmark and you understand what your program goals need to look like. And then this idea of what type of safeguards do you need to put in place to ensure that you do not have bias entering into your strategy and your programs. And sometimes that can look like as simple as we're bringing a lot of diverse talent into our funnel, but why are we not progressing those individuals forward beyond interview and placement and so forth? So there's some opportunities for conversations and collaboration between these two distinct functions. What else would you add about being the bridge between those two roles, Alex?
Yes. Again, it's that dialogue. What are the expectations you're holding your suppliers to? Do they have a scorecard in place? Do you review that? And more than review it, once you know the outcomes of that scorecard, how are you coming together to talk about go forward strategies and where you may need to shift or reprioritize? And then also there's the engagement between HR and procurement and ensuring that those strategies aren't built separately in silos, but they're developed together with the intent of meeting the needs of the organization, but also creating that wonderful experience and pathways for your employees.
Fantastic. So it really boils down to these three key actions. There's strategic actions for the business. They're the personal actions that you as an individual and in your role, all of us collectively in an organization need to take. And then there are the tactical actions that the organization has said we'll pursue in pursuit of the broader DEI strategy. So that is our time with all of you today. We welcome your questions. Again, you can put those in chat. It's been wonderful having this time with you. Hope that this content has been helpful, and we wish you a best rest of the event.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jocelyn.
Thanks, Alex.